lifted from heaven to a manger.
Today I'm in the home of my sweet friend, Miss Betty McAllister. You know, I can actually remember the first time I met Bob and Betty. Gabe and I were dating in college, and I think I came up to Dalhart with him for one weekend to come see his family. And on the way back to Canyon, we stopped at a convenience store. And in the convenience store, in walk just the sweetest little couple, Bob and Betty. And I could tell just by the way Gabe came on up to them and greeted them so friendly and warm, and I could tell from that moment that these were somebody really special. Come to find out later, when Gabe was 2 years old, him and his family moved from Indiana to Texas. When they moved from Indiana, they left behind all their extended family, all of his sweet grandparents. I've met his grandparents now from Indiana. Precious, precious people. They had to leave all that family behind when they moved to Texas. So when they came to Texas and they met Bob and Betty, they kind of adopted them in as their Texas grandparents. Well, if you've ever met Bob and Betty, you would understand why. You would want to adopt them in as your grandparents too. They were just that sweet, just have a sweetness to them that is just so from God. Well, as I'm standing here in Miss Betty's kitchen today, all kinds of nostalgic feelings start coming at me of my own grandparents. You know, I can remember the smell of my Meemaw's kitchen as she's baking her chocolate chip cookies. Or I can remember walking into my granny's kitchen on Christmas Eve, and it smells like brisket and her homemade stuffing. I love that stuff, it's so good. I love those memories we have of our grandparents and how special it is. Well, today, Miss Betty is making for us bread. And Miss Betty knows a few things about bread. Let me tell you, she has told me some just amazing, precious stories. There was a time when her and Bob lived in Roswell. They had 6 daughters. And in Roswell, she would bake 8 loaves of bread a day. And they would eat some of that for themselves, and then all the leftover extra loaves she had, she would sell. And the money she made from selling those loaves, she would use towards her girls to buy them piano lessons. Right? Precious stuff like that. Today, Miss Betty is making this bread in her home, the home she grew up in, the home that her and Bob were married in a long time ago. She is baking this bread in her mama's oven. I mean, how amazing is that? Gabe calls this Miss Betty's magic oven because everything that comes out of this oven just tastes amazing. So I wish today that I could send the smells coming from here to you to remind you of how good fresh bread smells. And that's going to lead us into our name for today. Jesus calls himself the bread of life. In the Bible, Jesus refers to himself as the bread of life. But to really understand this name, we're going to need some context. So we're going to go up a little higher in that chapter, chapter 6 in the Gospel of John. And in the very first part of chapter 6, Jesus has just crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. And he looks down and the crowds are following him. So he asks his disciples how they're going to feed such a large crowd. Well, the disciples go out and they find one boy who happens to have 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And so Jesus takes this little bit of food and he ends up feeding a crowd of well over 5,000 people. An astonishing miracle, and the crowd knows it. I love how Ann Spangler talks about this event in her book, Praying the Names of Jesus. And this is what she says. John's gospel says the bread was made out of barley. It was poor man's bread, not the fine wheat bread of the rich, but it filled them up and made them glad. Astonished by the miracle, some in the crowd began to make the connection. This was like the manna that Moses and the Israelites fed on in the desert. God was giving them a sign. Surely this must be the longed-for Messiah. The rumors spread swiftly through the crowd. Knowing what was in their hearts, that they wanted to make him king, Jesus withdrew into the mountains. But why? Why not soak up the admiration, the wide-eyed wonder of it all? Because Jesus wanted to do far more than feed bodies that were soon to perish. He wanted to nourish souls that could live forever. But the people only wanted more cheap bread. It's later on in chapter 6, in verse 35, that Jesus declares, I am the bread of life. And he says it again in verse 48. He says, I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread. You know, I wonder, what is it that we are feeding on? Do we only long for the temporary things that don't matter? You know, there are a lot of parts of Christmas that are temporary, right? The new toys we buy our kids will eventually get broken or sit up on the shelf with all their other toys. The Christmas meal that we will spend hours preparing will be gone and eaten in half an hour. We will spend days decorating our house with Christmas decorations and lights, only to have to spend days in January taking it back down. Temporary. Now, are these things bad? No way. But is that all that matters? Temporary things will never satisfy our hunger. We will always be hungry for more. It cannot satisfy. But Jesus can. Jesus is eternal. Feasting on him will stop the hunger. My friends, let's stop trying to fill ourselves up with the things of this world that will not last. Go to Jesus. Turn to the bread of life and be hungry no more.
Party, that's right.
Good morning, Tony.
You aren't a kid, are
He
you?
loves the honey.
Oh.
He most certainly does.
Really want some honey? Make you sweet.